Now that you've familiarized yourself with the interface and with working with static meshes, let's look at how to make a new map and work with some BSP geometry. I'm going to go to File, New, and now I've got a choice, additive or subtractive mode. Additive mode is, to me, it's a little bit more intuitive, and it's also really well suited for outdoor environments. It's basically, when you start, you're in the middle of blank space, and you build stuff into it. Subtractive mode is kind of like the entire world is solid rock, and you're carving into it. So if you're making a level that's all interiors, never goes outside, that may be a little bit more appropriate. But let's start with additive mode for now. All right, so first things first, we need to find our builder brush. If you're starting the editor from scratch, it'll automatically be centered, but since we were in that other map, it may be off screen in some of your views. So if you can find it in a view, just select it and press the home key, and that'll focus on it in all 4 views. If you can't find it anywhere, there's a little trick you can use. If you have nothing selected, if you remember from earlier, we did a control drag in order to move an object without using the gizmo. Well, if you have nothing selected and you control drag, it automatically selects your builder brush. So do that now, and then you can press the home key, and that'll center it in all 4 views. Now before we start building, let's save this file. I'm going to go to File, Save As. It'll start out in the Maps folder with all of the example maps that shipped with the UDK. But to keep things cleaner, I like to create my own folders to work in. So I'm going to create a new folder, and let's call this Gnomon DVD. Let's call this map BSP Room 01. All right, and from now on you can save using this icon here, Save Current Level. So you can think of the builder brush as a rubber stamp. Whatever shape and size it is, wherever it is in the world, you can stamp down real BSP geometry that the player will see and that the player will collide with. You can do that by pressing this button on the left-hand side here, CSG Add, or you can use the hotkey, Control A. So there we go. Now I've got an additive brush right where my builder brush was. And I can move the builder brush out of the way. And if I zoom in on one of the 2D views, you'll see I've got this blue box right where the builder brush was. That's my actual BSP geometry. And if I hit Control A again, I get another BSP brush over on the side now. So pretty straightforward, pretty easy to use. A couple of quirks with it though. If I select one of these additive brushes and I move it, what you'll notice is the polygons don't come with it. There's a little bit of a separation in concepts here, but you can sort of think of the additive geometry as a template for the world, and then the polygons are the actual mesh that get created from that template. So if you move the BSP mesh, it doesn't update the polygons right away. But that's easy enough to do. If you look at the top of the window, there's a little sort of teal colored box, and if you mouse over it, it'll say Build Geometry for Current Level. If I click on that, the polygons update to the new position of the additive brush. So not too bad. I can move them around, I can move both of them at the same time. The polygons will stay left behind until I rebuild, and then they update. For now, when you get these map check warnings, you'll get a couple warnings. Just ignore them for now. We'll get into those later in the DVD. So, the really cool thing about BSP geometry is that you can subtract as well. If I move my builder brush over so that it's sort of in the intersection between these two, I can click on this button here, CSG Subtract, or I can use the shortcut Control S. And you can see in the 3D viewport, it actually carved a hole where that builder brush was. It cut a hole into my additive geometry. And if I move the builder brush out of the way, you can see that there's now a yellow brush left behind, and that's a subtractive brush. And just like before, I can move the subtractive brush, say over here, and as soon as I rebuild geometry, the changes update in the 3D view. So subtractive geometry is really cool because it's a really natural way to build environments. Say we wanted to build a room and all we had available was additive geometry. You'd have to create separate brushes for the floor, for all 4 walls, and for the ceiling. And if you wanted to put a window or door in one wall, you'd have to split up that wall into even more pieces, and that can get really cumbersome. So subtractive geometry is a really easy and simple way to carve out of additive geometry to make the sorts of rooms and the sorts of shapes that you need. So let's save this off, and then we'll create a new file where we'll make our first room. So I'm going to hit Save, New, Additive, and then I'll immediately do a Save As, and call it BSP BSP Room 02. All right. First thing we need to do is set the size of the builder brush. We could scale it, but there's a couple big reasons why not to, and I'll get into those in a little bit. So for right now, let's figure out how to set the size directly. If you notice on the left-hand side, there's a bunch of icons. These are different shapes, different default shapes that you can make the builder brush. So I can do a cylinder, which is 8-sided, kind of looks like a stop sign, a cone, bunch of different primitives. So let's set it back to the cube. And what I can do is right-click on the cube icon, and I'll get an interface where I can type in the dimensions that I want this initial cube to be. I don't use this interface too often, usually just when I'm creating a new map and I need to get a sense of the scale. Now, the player in Unreal, I believe, is 88 units tall, and that scale is 16 Unreal units equals 1 foot in the real world. So an 88 unit tall character would be, I think, just a little bit under 6 feet tall. So that said, to give this room plenty of room to move around in, let's make the X and Y dimensions 512. So you can type that in and you'll see it updates right away. And then you can just leave Z alone. Ceiling height of 256 should be fine. So now that I've got my new, bigger room, I can click on the CSG Add button, and that gives me the exterior of my room. So now we'll create a subtractive brush to carve out of it. A couple ways we could do it. We can figure out exactly what the right size would be so that it's inset by one grid size, but that's kind of annoying. So instead, let's actually use the geometry editing tools to manually shape the brush exactly how we need it to be. So I'm going to close this window. I'm going to offset my builder brush by 1 step, and now I'll click on this icon here, Geometry Mode. Now what I can do is click on any of the edges of the builder brush and move them directly. So I can move the side, I can move the bottom, and now you can see the builder brush is completely inset inside of the additive brush. And I'll go into one of the side views, and I'll do the same thing. I'll take the ceiling, drop it down 1 step, and I'll take the floor and move it up 1 step. Otherwise, this would have been kind of like a hollow tube. So now that the builder brush is slightly smaller, I can hit my subtract button. And if I fly the camera inside, you can see that the room has been hollowed out. Alright, and if I move my... So if I have a face selected, or I've got this edge selected, I can deselect by just clicking somewhere on the grid, and then I can reselect the builder brush by clicking on it. And now I've got the whole thing selected, and I can drag it off to the side. So now you can see I've got that subtractive brush in the middle. So let's look at a couple extra tools here. So if I select my additive brush, like we saw, I can select an edge, and I can move it just like the builder brush. But I can also select one of the corners, one of the verts. And I can move just that. If I click on a vert in the top view, you'll notice in the side view, I select, or let me move to the perspective. You can see when I click on it, it actually selects all the way through. If there's 2 verts on top of each other, it'll select both of them. So that makes it really easy to move the corners however you need to. So let's put those back to where they were. I can control click to select 2 of the verts, just like we did with static meshes. And I can do a drag select. I can hold Control and Alt and select those verts, and then I can move them over. And I guess for the subtractive, I'll just select the edge and move it over. There, so now I've got a little bit bigger room, and I can hit Build Geometry to get the polygons in the scene to update. Now, one more thing you might have noticed. In the 3D view, those brushes don't normally show up until you have them selected. you can see there's no orange wireframe, there's no blue wireframe until I actually select the brush. And then at that point, I can actually click and select any of the verts or edges in the 3D view. But if you look at the top of the viewport, you can see here, right now we're in unlit mode. You can change to brush wireframe mode. And that's the same mode that the 2D views are in. And now I've got my subtractive brush and I've got my additive brush, and I can easily select them and modify them. So if I have my additive brush selected, in addition to moving edges and verts, I can also select a face and just move the face directly, which can be really convenient when working in perspective. Or of course I can drag select my verts in the 2D view and then move them in the 3D view, whatever you need to do. So for now, I'll go back to unlit mode and let's save what we've got. So let's set this room up so that we can actually play it in level. I can get rid of geometry mode by going back into camera mode, clicking on this button here, or the hotkeys for that. If you hit Shift 2, that'll go into geometry mode. Shift 1 will go back into camera mode, but you have to have one of the viewports selected. So I'll fly back inside the room. To be able to play it into the level, we need to do a couple things. First of all, we need to create a light. So to do that, there's a shortcut. I can hold L and click in the scene. Kind of like before, how we, to place a static mesh, we hold S and click. So if the light is immediately on a surface, it'll show up a little bit weird, but if you move it up into the middle of the room, it should render properly. Now, kind of like before, where we had to build geometry in order to see the actual polygons update, here we need to build lighting in order to get the final game lighting. Right now it's just sort of like a real-time preview. But if we build lighting, then we'll see the actual real baked radiosity renderer. So I'm going to click on that. Default settings are fine for now. And just wait for all of these progress windows to do their thing. And don't worry too much about the messages that pop up. And I'll occasionally pause my recording while waiting for things like light bakes and stuff, just so that you don't have to sit and wait for the whole thing. All right, but that's finished, so let's close these results windows. You can see the lighting in the room got a lot more blue. Again, that's because Unreal has a radiosity renderer, which means light will actually bounce off of the surface like it does in the real world. And since this wall is kind of a blue checkerboard already, it took that blue color and sort of propagated it around the room. So now that we have our lighting, there's only one more thing we need, which is a place for the player to spawn, and that's called a player start. Place one of those is really easy. Right-click on the ground, add actor, and it's the second choice from the top, add player start. And likewise, we need to do a build in order for that to register in the game, and that's called building paths. And that's this button here, immediately to the right of build lighting. Goes much quicker. Or there's this button here, build all, and that will rebuild all geometry, all lighting, and all paths. But I won't do that now because there's no point in waiting for it. So that's all set up. I'm going to save my map. Now to preview play it in level, we can click on this icon here. It looks like a little joystick. It says play this level in an editor window, which is sometimes abbreviated PIE, P-I-E, play in editor. And if I click on that, you can see it's basically the room that we created. I've got a weapon, I can shoot, I can jump and move around. I can also spawn bots into here if I want to preview what the gameplay is going to be like, and I can do that through the console. Two ways to bring up the console. I can press the Tab key to get a little console at the bottom of the screen, or I can press the key immediately above it, the tilde key, to get sort of a full screen console. That can be useful for some more complicated commands that report out details and stuff like that. But for right now, we'll just use Tab. Now the command to add bots is add bots, all one word, ADDBOTS. You can see I've got a sort of a tooltip there, and then I can press spacebar, and then I can type the number of bots that I want. So let's say 3 bots. We got our first one. Now I've only got one. Let me close out of there before I die. I've only got one player starting the level, so the bots can't spawn on top of each other. Otherwise, it would be able to spawn more of them. Now, there's another convenient way to run the level. So we just saw the Play in Editor button in the top right-hand corner, but you can also preview the level in an editor viewport, and you can spawn from exactly where your camera is. So that's this button here. Same sort of joystick icon, except it's got a little bit of a viewport icon on top of it. And if I click on that, I spawn directly into that viewport from exactly where the camera was. So that can be a really handy way to see exactly the level from that particular viewport. And if you want a bigger view or something, like if you've maximized the viewport, you can spawn full screen in there. So, pretty handy tools. Oh, and if you hadn't picked up on it, it's kind of second nature for me, but if you want to exit out of one of these viewports, just press the escape key, and that'll close it out. So let's take what we've learned so far and expand on it and learn a couple additional tools. I make sure I've saved what I've got, and this time I'm going to do a save as, and let's call this BSP Room 03. So what I'd like to do next is create a second room, sort of expand off of this one. We'll create a second room and we'll create a hallway connecting them. At this point, I'm not going to use the builder brush anymore, at least not right now. I'm just going to clone the existing brushes that I've already made. So I'll duplicate this off to the side, give it a little bit of a spacer, and I'll duplicate my subtractive brush over. All right, and yeah, let's make that a little bit smaller. It'll be easier to tell our rooms later on if they're a little bit different shape and size. So shrink that one down a little bit. All right, now let's make the hallway. I'll take this additive brush, clone it over, and now we'll need to resize it so it's smaller. What I'll do is align it like this, so that this edge is lined up with the other building. Then I can grab the top edge, bring it in a little bit, bottom, bring it in a little bit. You can almost think of this like an airwalk between two modules of a space station. And then I'll go into the side view and let's bring down the ceiling just a little bit. All right, let's see what that looks like in 3D. I'll go back to unlit and since I've been cloning brushes, they didn't show up right away, so I'll build geometry. All right, that's about what I was hoping for. Now notice one little gotcha at this point. If I select the brush, the pivot is way off to the side. What had happened, this is where the pivot was originally, and I've been moving edges and stuff so much, the pivot kind of got left behind. So the way to fix it is, it's a little quirky. Right click where you want the pivot to be, and then choose pivot, and then choose move here. Probably choose move here snapped so that it snaps to the grid. But if you do that, and you deselect and reselect, that was only temporary. So right click, pivot, move pivot here, snapped, right click, pivot, and then you can choose save pivot to pre-pivot. It's kind of technical, but if you just do that, you can reselect your brush and the pivot will be back in the middle. Of course, the other option would be when you clone over your additive brush, rather than lining up the edge first like I did, just put the pivot where you want it. So I guess I'll demonstrate. I put the pivot where I want it, and then it's not too much more work to just drag in all 4 edges, rather than having to only move 3 of them. And I can use the shortcut, hold Control and drag, and then I don't have to grab the move tool. So drag my ceiling back down, rebuild. There we go. And the pivot is right where I want it. So now let's do the same with the subtractive brush. Clone it over, put the pivot where I want it. Now, when I drag this in, I'm going to, let me do the top and bottom first. So I'm insetting by 1 grid line. And then for the left side and the right side, I'm going to align it exactly with the subtractive brush. And you can kind of picture this whole section will be filled in. along here, and then the part that's carved out will cut all the way through the wall from one room to the next. So there we go. Now I'll rebuild, and oops, you can see I forgot to move the ceiling down. So grab that, drop it down. Cool. Now if I go back to lit mode, you can see my light source is sort of penetrating through the hallway and into the next room. And when I bake, like I said, it's a radiosity renderer, which means the light will bounce around. So it'll actually fill this in a little bit. Let's actually save this. I'm going to do a rebuild all and bake and test this just to make sure that everything is working properly. I don't anticipate any problems, but it's always good to review your work as you go along. All right. All right, so you can see these walls were black before, but they got filled in now by some of the ambient light that bounced around. And let's play in viewport. All right, looks good. I got 2 rooms. Can run back and forth between them. Another handy thing with the console, rather than if I want to add bots again, I can type it again, or I can just press the up arrow, and that'll go to the previous command, whatever I typed in last. And it does have history, so the last, I'm not sure how many it remembers, but I can press up and down to go back to previous commands. So there we go. Cool. Let's look at some more stuff that we can do with BSP. Next, I want to look at how to make an angled surface. Not very tricky, just a couple things to keep in mind. So first what we'll do, let's make like a little ramp inside this room and a little platform that you can get up to. So let's start by making the room a little bit taller. I'll grab the additive brush, go into a side view, raise it up a little bit, and then we'll grab the subtractive brush and do the same. Okay. Build, and that looks pretty good. So now we need to create a ramp. I guess I'll use my hallway piece as a starting point. Drag that over. Actually, let's make the platform first. Don't want it to be too high. That looks pretty good. And I'll make it the entire length of the room. Build, and looks good. So for the ramp, okay, and the pivot ended up a good place. All right. So let's make the ramp off on the side here. Shrink it down to fit the right shape and size. All right, now if I look in the side view, what I can do is grab just this corner vert here and drop it down to floor level. So you can see in perspective, it becomes a nice angle that runs all the way down to the floor. This is a place where you'll need to be careful. If I take this vert and drag it down one more step, now my verts are on top of each other, and Unreal gets kind of confused. At this point, there's no way to really separate them out again, and it has some degenerate polygons. They just sort of collapsed in on themselves. There's potential for things to get wonky at that point. So I could undo, although it takes a little while sometimes. I've actually sort of done a lot of commands since I made that, so let's just delete it and start again. But lesson learned, don't collapse verts on top of each other. Let me stretch this out again. Sorry for making you watch this twice. So I'll grab that corner vert, drop it down. So what's safe is allowing these polygons to cut through the floor. Since Unreal calculates all the geometry at compile time anyway, it'll delete these internal faces. Those don't really exist. And so there's really nothing wasted by having this cut through the floor like that. So I'll let me build all, because I'm going to want to preview this in game. There we go. One other way to launch in Play in Editor. So we've seen this button here. We've seen Play in Viewport. I can also right-click on the ground and choose Play from here. And what that does is it pops up a new editor window at exactly the point that I clicked. And now I can run up and down the ramp. There is a limit to how steep of a surface you can run up. I think it's about 45 degrees, give or take. But experiment a little bit and see if you can figure it out for yourself. This room illustrates a really interesting aspect of BSP, which is that brush order matters. We took our initial building exterior, we subtracted out the interior, but then we added a platform and a ramp inside of that. And that platform and ramp weren't subtracted out by this subtractive brush, which means, well, like I said, brush order matters. Whatever order you create the brushes in is the order in which they're applied. But we can actually change the order of the brushes to get the results we want. So here's an example. So say this is what we have right now. We've got a brush that we added, a second brush that we added, and then a third brush that we subtracted out of both of them. We can actually change the order to something more like this, where we add and then subtract and then add on top of it. This third one here is kind of like our ramp or our platform that were added inside of the subtractive brush. So let's experiment with that a little bit. I'm going to save off this map and I'm going to create a new one, just a blank additive map, and we'll do a save as, and let's call this BSP Experiments 01. Alright, so I've got my builder brush. I'll add one, just like my illustration. I'll add a second one, and then let's do a third one and subtract out of that, and we'll move the builder brush out of the way. So that looks pretty much like what you would expect and kind of like what we had earlier. We're subtracting, obviously, out of both of these additive brushes. But what I can do, if I right-click on this additive brush, I can choose Order and choose To Last. So it used to be the second one that was created. If I move it to last, it'll be the third one. And then if I build geometry, there we go. The subtractive brush is subtracting out of the first one, but it's not subtracting out of the last one because now it's later in the chain. I can move this builder brush to last, and now effectively the subtractive brush isn't subtracting out of either of them. And I can move the subtractive brush to last, and now it'll subtract out of both of them. So normally that won't come up in normal building. Normally just the order in which you build things, like we did earlier, we carved the room and then built the platform into it. Normally the order just takes care of itself. But be aware that it's there, especially if you're cloning around brushes. The order in which they're created may not be consistent, and you may need to order the brushes manually by using this technique. So while we've got this experiments map open, I'll show you a couple more advanced features of the BSP tools. Let's go back into geometry mode. Now everything we've done so far has been in edit mode. If I select a face and I move it, well, it moves just like you'd expect. But I can go into extrude mode, and now if I move the face, it essentially gets duplicated, and I can move it again, and now I've got a longer segmented BSP hallway. And now I can go into edit mode and basically do whatever I want with these verts. I can make much more interesting shapes with this. Now, be careful. BSP isn't meant to be detailed geometry. It's meant to be very rough, very raw and simple geometry. So you don't want to actually sculpt any detail using these tools. But if you just need like a really simple shape, obviously like what I just created here, if you want to make a room that's not a perfect square, this can be a really good way to do it. There are a couple other tools inside of here too that I'm not going to cover everything, but play around a little bit. For instance, if I select two edges, which of course is really difficult to do in 3D, there we go. So if I select two edges, I can click on this split modifier. And what that'll do is it'll create a split all the way through the mesh, connecting those two edges. So that can be really useful too. So like I said, you can play with that some more on your own, but just know that there's a lot more options there. And just remember, go back into edit mode when you're done, otherwise you may have unexpected results. Oh, and yeah, any of this, what I just showed you, works both on the builder brush and it also works on any brushes you've already created, like an additive brush. So next, I'd like to talk about the grid and staying on it. We looked at this a little bit with static meshes, like the staircase asset I showed you, but it's extremely powerful and extremely important to stay on the grid with BSP. If I clone off this additive brush, move it off to the side, this is kind of the example I showed before with the staircases, but if I've got a second additive brush and I've got everything grid aligned, it's really easy to get these two brushes to line up perfectly. There's no seam here, there's no gap here, there's no overlap. It just works. Versus if I wasn't on the grid, oops, didn't mean to clone. If I wasn't on the grid, it's going to be really hard to line up those polygons. Even if it looks like I've got it right, if I zoom way in, that vertex may be slightly off the grid. So try to avoid that whenever you can. Try to stay on the grid. And generally, as a rule, the larger the grid snapping you use, the easier it'll be to build your BSP very rough early on, and then you can get more refined later on. But let's say you do find yourself with a vertex off the grid. You can snap it back onto the grid really easily by right-clicking on it. So there we go. I right-clicked and it popped right back onto the grid. And so now if I build, my polygon geometry is nice and clean. So let's look some more at the different primitive shapes you can use for the builder brush. We've obviously used the cube shape quite a bit. Another common one I use is the cylinder. It's just really good for generating some non-square shapes if you need a room that's, well, anything besides a square. The tricky thing with all these primitives, though, is like what I just mentioned. It's BSP isn't meant for detailed geometry. BSP is really either just for roughing out the space, or in the final level, it's sort of the base geo that you put detail props on top of. So you really don't want a cylinder with too many sides. Obviously, it's good for something like an octagonal room, but you wouldn't want to make a column or a pillar out of it or something like that. You're better off just using a square BSP block and then replacing it with a static mesh later on. But that said, like I said before, a cylinder can be useful. One of the problems is inherently the verts tend to be off the grid. So if you do create one, you'll want to go through each of the verts and right-click on it in order to grid snap it. It can be a little time consuming, but again, you don't have a lot of options when creating a non-square room. Either make a cylinder or something like this, or you can extrude some of the edges. So whichever you think is faster for you. I don't really use any of the other primitives. Something like you can create a staircase, but a lot of times I'd just create a simple ramp rather than the staircase, and then the stairs are better off as a static mesh later on anyway. This will look way too polygonal and hard-edged to really sell in an Unreal environment. Same with the tetrahedron, the sphere. It's just not a shape that occurs very much in architecture. You can right-click on it to add more detail to it, but you don't really need to do that very often. Just use a static mesh if you really need a sphere. Kind of the same thing with a cone. That does come up occasionally, but yeah, again, not too often. Really, a cube and a cylinder are the main ones that I use. So let's set that back to a cube. I want to show you a couple other useful features and something else that might catch you up when you're building with BSP. So first, if you want to select a BSP brush in the perspective viewport, but you don't want to go to brush wireframe mode, what you can do is hold Control and Shift and then click on a surface, and Unreal will select whatever brush makes up that surface. So I can select either of these additive brushes. If I Control Shift click on more than one thing, it adds to the selection. And then I can Control-Shift-Click on one of these interior polygons to select the subtractive brush. So that can make it really quick and easy to start working on your meshes and start building in the perspective mode without having to go into either brush wireframe mode or to go into one of your 2D views to select the brushes. And then of course I can rebuild to see the changes. And then one thing to watch out for, be really careful, don't accidentally take the verts or an edge of your brush and move them opposite, because effectively what you're doing at that point is you're turning your brush inside out. And if I rebuild, my brush has turned into some weird sort of hybrid of additive, subtractive. It's kind of hard to explain and kind of hard to visualize what's happening, but essentially the brush is inside out. And it's easy to fix just by moving the verts back to the other side. But if you've got a whole level built up at this point, sometimes it can be really hard to tell which brush it is that's actually inside out. Usually you have to do a sort of divide and conquer where you delete half your brushes, rebuild, see if it fixed the problem, delete half the brushes again, etc. So just be conscious of that and be careful that you don't do that. One last thing to watch out for is, I mentioned this before, when you're working in BSP, especially in the 2D viewports, make sure you're in world mode. If you go into local mode by accident and you select some of your verts, well, I can tell right now my widget is all screwed up, and if I drag, I'm not even square anymore. But in some cases, the widget will still look like it's squared off, and you'll think you're doing the correct thing, but you can really screw things up. Like here with the edge, it almost looks like I can move it correctly in this dimension, but I'll just end up way off the grid if I do that. So be careful, make sure you're always in world mode when working with BSP, especially in the 2D views. Alright, so we've covered a lot of details with BSP building, but let's wrap it up with a simple building example. I'll save this off, and I'm going to go back to my BSP Room 3 map. And what I'm going to do is expand this a little bit, show you maybe not any new tools, but I'll show you how I would go about building a couple different types of architecture and how I would turn this into a real level. So I'll do a save as, let's call it BSP Room 04. And what this will be is sort of an exterior space. I'll keep it the 2 rooms, but I'm going to turn it into a building, and there'll be a courtyard outside with a little bit of interesting geometry, walls surrounding it, and then I'll show you how to place in a sky dome so that you're not just looking at black space. So first of all, let's cut a hole in to the outside. So I'm going to duplicate this this hallway subtractive brush. So that'll give us, where is that? That'll give us a little doorway here. And notice I'll build occasionally just to see what's going on, but usually I've got a pretty good sense for it, so I won't need to. Now we want to make the outside. So what I'm going to need is a ground plane, something for the player to stand on. We'll need 3 walls and then all the detail inside of it. So I'll clone over one of my buildings, sort of line that up. And in one of the side views, I'll grab the top edge and make it shorter. Alright, looks good. I'm going to need a little bit more light in here, so just real quick I'm going to place one more light outside, although for the final level I'd use more like a directional light or something. So now from the outside this building doesn't look quite right. It doesn't really make sense that there'd be this little tiny hallway connecting 2 individual rooms. So what I'm going to do is delete the hallway, delete this second room, and then just take my my first room exterior and make it a little bit bigger so that it encompasses the whole thing. Now this is where brush order might become an issue. I don't think it will. Let's go inside and find out. Okay, yeah. So the brush I have selected, this additive brush, was the very first thing I made, so all the subtractions are happening after it. So that's all in good shape. Alright, so I got my two interior rooms, my exterior space. I think I'll need to make that a little bit bigger, just based on what I'm planning. Alright, now I've got an option. I want to put some walls up around this so that the player can't fall off the edge. Either I could do kind of like my rooms so far, where I've got one big additive brush with a subtractive carving out of it. That doesn't feel right in this case. I don't know what these walls are eventually going to become. They may open up even more. So I think I'm just going to do 3 additive brushes, one for each wall. So I'll clone this guy over. Notice I do drag select and grab the verts more often than not, rather than selecting an edge. For me, it's just a little bit faster. I can be a little bit sloppier with my selection. I don't have to carefully get the mouse in place and then click. I can just go like that and I'm done. So that'll be up to you. That's just personal preference. All right, so I got that wall. Clone it over. Clone it over one more time. I could rotate this now. I don't think I'm going to because just everything in me tells me stay on the grid, never ever rotate BSP. But if I'm rotating 90 degrees, technically it's not breaking anything. I guess I can do it. And I'm making sure that when I rotated, the very end verts didn't get off the grid, but it looks like those are okay. All right, so I got my 3 walls. Oops. Undo, undo, undo. All right. Rebuild. Cool. Now let's test this to see if there are any issues. Like for instance, I forgot to bake lighting. I'll just do a build all. All right. I'll do a plate from here. Cool, the walls seem tall enough that I can't see over them. And everything inside still works. All right, so far so good. Yeah, let's just do some really simple little geometry. I think I'm gonna make a recessed section where the floor goes down over here. And then I'm gonna make a couple pillars and we'll call it a day. So to make the recessed section, I wanna drop the geometry down. So I'll Control Shift click to select that brush and I'll make the floor deeper in one of the side views. Now I'll clone over one of my subtractive brushes. Let's make it the whole size of the outside. So it would work right now. It's a little bit taller than the space. Wouldn't hurt anything, but it's just a little sloppy. And that makes it kind of hard to tell what's going on once the scene gets really complicated. So I'd rather have it exactly fit to the space it needs to subtract. Oops, I guess I didn't account for that. I'll just nudge either, so to get rid of this hole, so you can see I ended up with a hole here. Either I could make the building deeper to fill that up, or I think what I'm going to do is just quick and easy. I'm going to move these verts in by 1 notch. So I've got a little bit of a lip there, but that's okay. And then let's make this a little bit smaller, and let's make a ramp so that you can get into it and out of it. Oops, so my vert is outside. So pivot, move here, pivot, save pivot. All right. All right, now this will become our ramp. So rather than making an additive ramp like we did before, I'm going to make a subtractive ramp that cuts into the additive geometry. All right, so that's like that. Oops. All right, so we've got a notch cut. Now all I need to do is raise it up. So just like before, I don't want to turn this into a triangle. I want to make sure it's still four-sided. So I raised up the top a little bit so that I have enough room to keep it a four-sided shape. So now if I rebuild, there we go. And then we got a ramp cut in. And lastly, I wanted to make a pillar. So rather than grabbing one of the existing brushes, I know the builder brush by default will be pretty much the right shape and size. So a little trick I can use, I can select a nearby object, like this light source, and then left click on the builder brush, and that'll create the builder brush at that position. It'll basically create it immediately on top of whatever I had selected, using whatever the default size is that's plugged in. So now I can, where do I want this? Let's put a pillar in the corner here. I guess it is still a little too big, so let me shrink it down. Now, my intent for this, if I'm planning on turning this into a real level, this pillar will eventually be something ornate. It'll maybe be like a decorative pillar with some plants growing out of it, or something like that. But it will eventually be static meshes. But for now, I just need to get it in there because it's going to have an effect on the gameplay space. Oops. Control A to add, and then get this guy out of the way. So I'm just roughing it in. This is eventually going to be much more detailed, but it's just there to get the idea across until I have time to art it up later. So I'll put one of those in all four corners, and I think this one is going to be intersecting my door a little bit. Not exactly, but it's pretty close. So let me nudge that over. And these guys aren't flush against the wall. All right, so let me save. I'm going to rebuild all. And again, I'm pausing my recording while that happens so that you guys don't have to wait. All right, looks pretty good. I guess I'll save again. And let's play it. All right. Not too pretty, but definitely functional. And lastly, let's put in a sky dome so that we're not looking at a black space. I'm going to go back to the content browser and select UT Game, and I'm going to search for the word sky. So a sky dome is just simply, you can tell here it's a static mesh that's kind of dome shaped that you place in the world. So with that selected, I'm going to hold S and click on the floor. And it came in surrounding my level. It's a little bit small, so I'll switch to the scale tool and scale it up by holding Control and dragging. So it's much bigger now so that you can't tell the parallax. You can't tell that you're actually really close to it. There are a bunch more settings we're going to want to set on the sky eventually. Right now it's going to cast shadows and it's going to take collision and all kinds of stuff like that. I'll cover what those are in a later chapter. That's kind of outside the scope of this right now. But if I launch again, and I go outside, now I've got a sky. So that's kind of the process I would use when building a level. You can tell a lot of the tools that I've covered, I kind of mix and match them. Sometimes I select edges, sometimes I drag select verts, sometimes I work additive, sometimes I work subtractive. It's kind of a big mix, but once you get the hang of it, you'll be able to use the right tools for the job ahead. One last note, I'll save my map. I'm going to use this BSP room 04 as an example going forward. So if you're working on a map as well, keep it up to date because we're going to use this through a lot of the rest of the DVD. If you try baking lighting at this point, you may notice that it got a lot slower now that we put the sky dome in. This is kind of fundamental in how Unreal's radiosity renderer works. Essentially, whatever the playable space is, whatever the geometry is, it calculates its bounce lighting inside of there. And since we've got this really huge sky dome surrounding the whole level now, effectively it has to calculate radiosity light in a much bigger space. But what we can do is tell Unreal, hey, we don't want to do that. We only care about all of this geometry here. And if we do that, bake times will return to normal. So the way to do it is this. Take your builder brush and let's expand it so that it just covers the playable space. Oops. So I'll leave a little breathing room. But go in the side view too. Make it big enough to cover the whole space. And what we need to do is create a volume that tells Unreal do a full detail bake only inside of this volume. And to do that, it's kind of similar to adding additive geometry, but it's this icon here, Add Volume. And if you right click on it, we've got choices for a whole bunch of different types of volumes. And the one we want right now is called Light Mass Importance Volume. If I click on that, and then move my builder brush out of the way, you can see we've got this sort of off green colored volume here surrounding the level. Now if I save, and now if I bake, things should go at a pretty reasonable speed. There we go. So the next BSP tool I'd like to show you is how to apply materials to the surfaces. Usually if a level is in the early prototyping phases like this, the material placement doesn't need to be exact. Usually it would just be to get the right theming, or if you want an area to be really dark for a specific gameplay intent, you could get that in. But most of the surface will eventually be covered with static meshes, so you don't really need to worry about careful placement or texture alignment at this point. But that said, let's look into how to do it. I'm going to open the content browser, and let's look for some appropriate materials. I've got UT Game selected. So there's two types of materials we can apply to a surface. If we look at the object type column here, I can filter by materials, and the text is cut off, but we can also look at material instances, and we want to choose the upper one. Both of these are usually going to be good for applying to a wall or a floor or something. I'm going to get rid of my search field for now. And this is some place where the tags come in really handy. If you look at the list, one of them is labeled buildings. And just about every material that would be appropriate for BSP geometry has been tagged with building. Or outdoors if you're doing like a dirt floor or something like that. But for right now, if we choose material instances, materials, and buildings, that'll narrow down the list pretty well. And then at that point, you can scroll through and start to look for materials that you think would be appropriate for your surfaces. These obviously look like they'd be good on a floor. Maybe some of these with the horizontal stripes might be good for a wall. So what I'm going to choose, oops, I accidentally clicked on the very right-hand bar here instead of grabbing the scroll bar. In the search box, I'm going to type brick. I looked this up earlier. This is the material I want to use. Let's just start with one of the interior rooms. And I'm going to apply this brick material to a wall. So the simplest way to do that is drag and drop it onto the surface. But if you're doing a lot of surfaces, that can get a little time consuming. So what I'm going to do, the shortcut, is if you have something selected in the content browser, you can hold Alt-click. Well, Alt and then click on a surface to apply that material to the surface. So that's pretty easy to use. So let's apply that to the walls, and then I'm going to search for organic, and I'm going to grab this one here, the sort of darker brownish, sort of brownish green tile pattern. And I'm going to select that and Alt-click to apply it to the floors. All right. And let's grab Organic 05B, I guess either of these two, and let's apply that as our ceiling. So select that and Alt-click on the ceiling. All right, so that looks reasonably good, at least for a level that's this early on. So say you closed out your content browser and you've already placed all the materials that you want in your scene and you don't want to have to go in and search for them again. Like say I want to apply this wall texture to the edge of this platform. Rather than go in and open it up and try to remember what search term I used, I can essentially do like the color sampler tool in Photoshop. I can hold Alt and right click on the wall to sample the material, and then I can Alt left click to place it. And then I can Alt right click on the floor to sample that, and I can Alt left click to place it on the platform. So that can be a really quick and easy way to clone stamp essentially your textures around the level. So at this point, if we wanted to apply these materials to all the surfaces, it wouldn't take too long. This level isn't that big, and having to do an Alt left click on every surface wouldn't be that painful. But if you can imagine a larger map, something the size of DM Sanctuary, that could take a really long time. So there are a couple tools we can use to speed up the process. Now let's look at the floor first. Say I wanted to apply this material to the entire floor. I can right click. There's an option called Select Surfaces. And then you can choose, well, all kinds of options, but let's choose adjacent floors. And what that'll do is select basically any floor that's connected to it. Now what I can do is Alt right click on this texture to sample it, and then I can right click and then apply material, and that'll basically apply that material to any face that I have selected. So there we go. Let's do the same with the walls. I can grab one of these exterior walls, select surfaces, adjacent walls, and that pretty much selects the entire level at this point. And then I can Alt right click to sample this texture, and then right click, apply material. And now I've got that on basically every surface. And I could do the same thing for the ceilings, although they're not really adjacent. They've got kind of a gap in between them. So usually for ceilings, it's faster just Alt left click to apply it. Now, this looks okay, but it's starting to look a little bit noisy. I think this wall texture, while it's a good texture, it's maybe repeating a little bit too often. So we can actually adjust the tiling and the spacing of any material application using this tool up here, the texture alignment mode. So what I'm going to do, right click, select surfaces, matching texture. So that's pretty much anything with that material applied to it. Now I can pretty much use any of my widgets to control the alignment. I can move it all up and down, left and right. I could rotate it, although that doesn't usually look very good on a wall, or I can scale it. And so that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale it a little bit bigger so that I don't have so much repeating grungy noise detail on everything. So that looks a little bit better. You want to be careful with that. Take a close look at your texture, or your material rather, and make sure that it actually looks good once you've scaled it up. Different materials were meant to be viewed at different sizes, and if you go too big with it, well, not only will it look blurry when you get up close to it, the details may not feel right. This one seems okay though. It's kind of got these sort of brick mortar patterns in it, and those look about real world scale, so that's pretty good. The floor, I don't think I'd want to change at all. The scaling on that seems correct. And then likewise for the ceiling, that seems correct as well. So I think that looks a little bit better. Now there's another way you can control the tiling and details of a surface more directly. If you select a surface, you can press F4 to bring up the properties. And that's true for pretty much anything in the game. F4 will always bring up the properties window. There's a lot of detail on this page that we're not going to go into right now. But real quick, the the panning, rotation, and scaling, which you can do with the widgets under texture alignment mode, you can also do in the window here. If I click on these numbers, you can see it's moving my texture to the side. If I hold Control and Shift and click on it, it moves it the opposite direction. Same with rotation. And then under scaling, I can plug in exactly the scale I want, say 4 times tiling, and then hit apply to see what that looks like. Or I can hit custom if I want to do 3 or 3. Or I can even make it a non-uniform scale. I can make it 1 and 10, and you'll see it's really stretched, which normally you don't want to do, but occasionally that does come in handy. Now, there's one other really handy thing you can do in here. Notice these floor materials, this tile, doesn't really line up very well when it moves from one brush to the next. There's kind of a disjointedness in the floor. Well, we can basically remap all of these floor materials so that they use the same coordinates. To do that, I selected them all, and then that's this option here, alignment. Default is whatever is assigned right now, so I'm going to switch to planar, which basically means it's going to top-down map all of these surfaces. And then if I hit apply, now they've all been mapped together, and so now the material cleanly passes from one brush to the next. So that can be really handy. Now one little gotcha with that is if you're in texture alignment mode, it's really easy to forget you're in texture alignment mode, and then if you try to move something, you'll grab the widgets and nothing will happen, and it may not be obvious what's going on. So just remember, if you go into texture alignment mode, make sure you get back out of it again by going back into camera mode. So let's look at a couple areas where you might get into a little bit of trouble with applying materials. So first rule, maybe not a hard and fast rule, but in general, don't apply any materials that have opacity in them. For instance, there's this chain link fence material. If I apply it to the wall, it kind of looks weird. You might be tempted to use this in small areas, but ultimately you can see through it. You can see through the backside of this face here, and it just looks kind of strange. Again, technically it doesn't break anything. It just doesn't hold up to close scrutiny. Even if you were to make a solid, thin piece of VSP that actually was shaped like a proper chain link fence, just look for the static mesh instead. It'll look a lot better. So I'm going to clobber that out. Next, and this is actually a little bit trickier, don't use a material that has actual transparency on it. So this one is what we call opacity masked, meaning if I zoom in on the preview here, you can see it's still hard-edged. It just has some areas that are fully transparent, some that are solid. But there are other materials that are blended, like if, let me filter by effects materials. So if I accidentally apply this explosion material on the surface, you can see that that has soft transparency. The trick here is, by default in Unreal, you can't select transparent surfaces. So once I apply that to the wall, it's really hard to select it to get rid of it. So if you do that by accident, you need to turn on this mode, Allow Translucent Selection. If I click on that, now I can select that wall, and now I can apply a material over it. That's just there in case you've got VFX in the level or volumetric lighting or something like that. It's too easy to accidentally select it rather than the surface you're going for. So usually that's off by default. But if you do accidentally assign a translucent material to a surface, you can use this option to be able to select it. Now, next rule. Again, this one isn't a hard and fast rule, but in general, don't apply a prop material to a surface because it won't look good. So if I search for crate, oops, I gotta go back to the top level. Here we go. So if I apply this crate material to the wall, it may look okay at first glance, but again, it's kind of like that chain link fence. It just doesn't look right. It doesn't hold up to the close scrutiny in a real final level. There's all kinds of geometry detail that's sort of implied in here that you can tell it's just a flat surface, or like when one of these circular areas cuts hard into the ground. It just doesn't look right. So even if it looks cool and high tech in some situations, almost always it just doesn't look as good as placing the actual prop that this material was meant to be used on. So let me clobber that out. Next thing that might occasionally hang you up, if you're not paying careful attention to your object types, you may select the texture and try applying it to a surface and nothing happens, or you clobber out whatever was there. We'll go into more detail about the difference between a material and a texture later. Just keep in mind that they are a different thing, and you can only apply materials to surfaces in your level. One last note. In general, you only want to apply materials to the surfaces in your level that the player can actually see. For instance, the ceiling, I go back to unlit mode, or I should say the rooftop of this building, the player is never going to be able to get up there, or the tops of these pillars. If you leave this default checkerboard texture on those surfaces, we can do some optimization later on that'll save you a lot of memory. It'll speed up light baking, and it'll speed up the frame rate a little bit too. So as much as possible, try to keep all of the non-visible surfaces with this checkerboard texture on them. So, for instance, when I did the select adjacent walls, I selected pretty much everything in the level, including the back of this building that you never see. So if you do that, you may want to just take a few minutes and quickly clobber out any of those hidden materials, because we can do some optimization later. And we'll cover that during the lighting section of this DVD, which is what we're going to do next.